In the 3rd century, a Roman emperor named Maximinus Thrax, a man famous for his size and his appetite, reportedly sat down and ate 20 lobsters in a single sitting. Roman chefs wrote entire cookbooks full of recipes for it. Roman coins and Greek pottery carried its image. 1,500 years later, prisoners on the coast of Massachusetts were furious about being served the exact same animal, because being forced to eat it was considered a punishment. The same creature, 2 civilizations, 2 verdicts, centuries apart. One called it food fit for an emperor. The other called it food fit for a cell. Let's dig in. Long before a single European boot touched the shore of New England, lobster already had a reputation, and it was the opposite of the one it would later earn in America. In the Mediterranean world of ancient Greece and Rome, lobster wasn't garbage, it was status. Greek artisans put lobsters on coins. Around 460 BCE, someone shaped an entire wine vessel, a drinking party dispenser meant to be passed around at a symposium, in the form of a lobster claw. That's not the kind of object you make for a food nobody respects. You make it for a food people want to be seen holding. The Romans took it further. The philosopher Plutarch wrote about lobsters getting hunted by octopuses in his essay on animal behavior. The cookbook, attributed to the famous Roman gastronome Apicius, contains 7 separate lobster recipes, grilled with cumin sauce, minced and folded into other dishes, dressed with pine nuts and fresh herbs. This wasn't a niche ingredient. It was expensive enough and prestigious enough that a wealthy Roman host would serve it specifically to show off. In Petronius's novel Satyricon, a lobster shows up as one course in an elaborate zodiac-themed banquet built entirely around conspicuous consumption. And then there's Maximinus, the soldier emperor known for his size and his appetite, who, according to Roman writers, could put away 20 lobsters at a single meal. Treated less as a strange habit and more as a story worth repeating, because everyone already understood lobster was a luxury. That reputation didn't vanish with Rome. Historians studying the medieval Mediterranean have found lobster still turning up as a prized food, and even a folk aphrodisiac well into the Middle Ages, including a mosaic depicting clawed lobsters found in a region far outside where the species actually lives, suggesting the animal had become valuable enough to be worth depicting even where nobody could catch one. And it wasn't only a Mediterranean habit. Food historians researching English cuisine note that lobster was held in real esteem by the British in particular, long before any of them set foot in America, a coastal delicacy served at the tables of people who could afford to be picky about what they ate. It was Englishmen carrying that exact reputation with them who crossed the Atlantic and founded the colonies where lobster's status would collapse entirely. So, by the time Europeans started crossing the Atlantic in the 1600s, lobster wasn't an unknown creature to them. It was, if anything, a food with a pedigree, something an emperor ate, something worth putting on a coin, something the folks back home in England still served with pride. Which makes what happened next so strange. When those same English colonists reached the rocky coast of Massachusetts and Maine, they found so much lobster that the animal's entire reputation collapsed within a generation. Not because the lobster changed, because the math changed. A luxury good stops being a luxury good the instant it's infinite. And on the New England coast, for the first time in the animal's long relationship with Europeans, it was. After a storm hit the Massachusetts coast in the 1600s, lobsters didn't wash up in ones and twos. They washed up in mounds 2 feet high, sometimes taller. Not a handful of stragglers, but heaps of them, piled along the tide line like debris. These weren't the 1 and 2 pound lobsters sold in tanks today either. Colonial-era lobsters regularly weighed 5 or 6 pounds, with some specimens reportedly topping 20. Pulling one out of the water was like pulling out something the length of a grown man's arm. The Native American communities who had lived on that coast for thousands of years before the English arrived had already worked out what to do with an animal that abundant, not as a delicacy, but as a tool. Lobster meat baited fishing lines. Crushed lobster shells went straight into the soil as fertilizer. Some communities wrapped lobster in seaweed and cooked it over heated stones, a technique the English colonists would later borrow and turn into the New England clam bake. But even the people who understood lobster best didn't treat it as prized food. It was a resource, not a centerpiece. The colonists followed the same logic, just with less restraint. Lobster went into pig troughs. It got scattered across vegetable beds like mulch. Fishermen hauling in cod and mackerel considered lobsters an outright nuisance, something that tangled the real catch. And by the 1700s, coastal Mainers were simply calling them bugs. When William Bradford, the governor of Plymouth Colony, wrote about a brutal stretch of near starvation in 1623, he described the best meal his settlement could offer visitors as a lobster or a piece of fish without bread or anything else but a cup of fair spring water. He wasn't bragging about seafood. He was apologizing for how little his people had left to offer. Archaeologists have confirmed just how far back this abundance actually goes. Coastal shell middens, essentially ancient trash heaps of discarded shells left behind by generations of indigenous communities, show people along the Atlantic seaboard eating shellfish for thousands of years before any European ship arrived. Lobster wasn't a novelty the English stumbled onto. This coastline had been feeding people off its shellfish for longer than most civilizations have existed, quietly, without the animal ever once becoming rare enough to matter. Within a single century of English settlement, the animal that Roman emperors had shown off at banquets, the animal English aristocrats back home still served with pride, had been reduced, on the American side of the ocean, to something you fed to hogs and buried in your garden. Same species, same claws, same tail, same meat. What had changed was supply. And supply, it turns out, can erase a reputation faster than any amount of history behind it. If abundance explained why lobster fell out of favor, what kept it there for another 2 centuries was something closer to social engineering. By the 1700s, lobster had become the default protein for people with no say in what they ate. Indentured servants, apprentices, enslaved people, and prisoners along the New England coast were all fed lobster regularly, not because anyone believed it was healthy or delicious, but because it was essentially free and endlessly available. Some accounts from the period claim servants in Massachusetts grew so tired of it that they negotiated limits directly into their contracts, clauses capping how many times a week they could legally be served lobster. The number varies by account. Some say twice, some say 3 times. Historians Keith Staveley and Kathleen Fitzgerald, who've researched this specific claim, have found that while coastal prisoners probably were served lobster on occasion, the idea that it made up their steady diet has likely been exaggerated over time. The real prison staples were salt pork, hardtack, salt cod, and baked beans, the kind of dense, shelf-stable food you'd actually expect from a colonial-era institution. The historian, Sandra Oliver, has traced an almost identical version of this same protest story being told about salmon in the 1800s, with nearly identical details, which suggests the exact anecdote may have drifted between species over time. But whether or not the specific contract clauses are historically precise, the underlying social reality clearly was. Lobster carried a stain, and everyone on that coast understood it. That stain showed up in language too. A Kentucky politician named John Rowan was said to have remarked that lobster shells scattered around a house were a visible sign of poverty. And people took that seriously enough to act on it. Families who relied on lobster reportedly buried the shells in their own backyards rather than let a neighbor glance at the pile by the door and draw the obvious conclusion. Consider what that means. The same animal that today gets displayed on crushed ice in a glass case so a diner can hand-pick their own was once something people quietly hid the evidence of eating. Two very different mechanisms then, working on the same food. One was pure economics. Lobster was so overwhelmingly plentiful that no one could treat it as special. The other was social. Even once it stopped being quite so overwhelming, an entire regional culture had spent a century building the association between lobster and shame. And that kind of reputation doesn't reverse itself just because the tide changes. A coastline can run out of surplus lobster in a decade. It takes a great deal longer to run out of the story a whole region has told itself about what eating that surplus lobster meant. What finally broke lobster's reputation wasn't a chef, and it wasn't a marketing campaign. It was a tin can, and it worked because it reached people who had absolutely no idea lobster was supposed to be embarrassing. In 1842, the first lobster cannery opened in Eastport, Maine. The logic was simple. Lobster was cheap. Canning technology had just become commercially viable, and a sealed tin could travel anywhere rail lines and shipping routes could reach. Canned lobster started showing up on shelves in Ohio, in Missouri, eventually as far as California, landlocked places where nobody had ever seen the coastal stigma firsthand. These customers had never heard the jokes about lobster being the cockroach of the sea. They'd never seen a 2-foot pile of them rotting on a beach. They just tasted the meat, and they liked it. By 1880, 23 canneries were running along the Maine coast, and for the first time in the animal's American history, demand started catching up to supply, which meant lobsters that canneries had once tossed back for being too small were suddenly worth processing anyway. Then came the railroads. As rail networks expanded across the country in the late 1800s, dining car operators needed cheap food they could serve to passengers on long hauls. And lobster, still inexpensive on the coast, could be packed in ice and shipped inland by the carload. Crucially, nobody in Kansas or Nebraska carried any of New England's baggage about what lobster meant. Railroads didn't serve it as coastal leftovers. They served it as something exotic. Midwestern passengers who'd never tasted it before went home talking about the incredible new food from their train trip. And as that word spread, so did demand, and so did price. Around the same period, a new kind of fishing vessel called a well smack, built with flooded holding tanks that let seawater circulate through the hull, made it possible to transport live lobster over much longer distances without losing the catch. Live lobster, cooked fresh, tasted dramatically better than anything that had spent time in a tin. For the first time, lobster was being handled less like a penalty and more like a product worth protecting. None of this was coordinated. A cannery owner in Eastport, a railroad dining car manager somewhere in the Midwest, and a boat builder rigging a smack tank never sat in a room together and agreed to rebrand an entire species. But each one, working independently, nudged lobster's reputation a little further from where it started. It's worth pausing on how unusual that is, historically. Most food reputations that flip this dramatically get flipped on purpose, by a chef, a marketing campaign, a royal endorsement. Lobster's turnaround had none of that. It was three unrelated industries solving three unrelated logistics problems and stumbling, almost by accident, into the same result. Here's a question that sounds too simple to matter and turns out to matter enormously. What actually counts as a lobster? The animal Maine is famous for, the one with the two big front claws, is what scientists call a true lobster, genus Homarus. There's the American version, Homarus americanus, and a closely related European cousin, Homarus gammarus, found off the coasts of Britain, France, and Scandinavia. But step outside that one genus, and the word lobster starts covering things that aren't remotely the same animal. Spiny lobsters, sometimes called rock lobsters, belong to an entirely different family and have no claws at all. Their defense is a spiny shell, not a pair of crushers. They're the ones you'll find on menus across the Caribbean, Australia, and the Mediterranean. And in several of those places, including South Africa and Australia, they're not even called lobster locally. They're called crayfish, a word most English speakers reserve for a small freshwater animal you'd find in a stream. Then there's the confusion in Europe. What the French call langoustine, and diners elsewhere might see menu listed as scampi, is a real, true lobster in the technical sense, part of the same broader family as the Maine lobster. But it's a different genus, Nephrops, and it's roughly the size of a large shrimp. Order langoustine expecting a Maine-sized claw feast, and you'll be disappointed. It's a delicate, slender animal, built for a completely different kind of plate. And to make things messier still, there's langostino, a word that sounds almost identical to langoustine, but refers to something else again. A small crustacean more closely related to hermit crabs than to any lobster at all. In the United States, food labeling regulators have had to step in and explicitly rule that the word langostino cannot be marketed simply as lobster, because regulators decided consumers would reasonably be misled if it were. There's an even stranger twist buried in this naming chaos, and it loops directly back to New England. Remember that Maine fishermen in the 1700s dismissively called lobster bugs. In Australia today, a flat, clawless slipper lobster, harvested off the coast of Queensland, is affectionately called the Moreton Bay bug, or just the bug for short. And it's treated as a genuine delicacy, sweet and prized, served split down the middle and grilled with nothing more than herb butter. One culture used bug as an insult to justify feeding an animal to pigs. Another uses it as an affectionate nickname for a dish people specifically travel to eat. This isn't just trivia, it's the same underlying tension that, as it turns out, would eventually escalate into an actual international standoff between two governments over the very question of what a lobster legally is and who gets to decide. On one side of the world, lobster had come to mean poverty. On the other, it had settled on the opposite verdict centuries earlier. In Japan, a species of spiny lobster called ise ebi, named for the coastal region of Ise where it's traditionally fished, has been treated as a luxury and a good luck symbol since at least the early 1700s, and its cultural roots run deeper than that. Shrimp and lobster both appear in Japanese texts stretching back to the Nara period, over 1,000 years earlier, and by the time of the samurai, the animal had already worked its way into wedding banquets as a symbol of luxury and purity. The lobster's curved, bent-over body was read as resembling an elderly person stooped with age, which made it a natural symbol of long life. Its hard, segmented shell was compared to samurai armor, and samurai families adopted lobster motifs into their crests and sword fittings as a symbol of protection. Its trailing antennae were described as looking like a long white beard. None of this was incidental decoration. It became a fixture of osechi ryori, the elaborate, symbolically loaded meal eaten in Japan to welcome the new year, where ise ebi is served specifically as a wish for a long life for everyone at the table. And it remains, to this day, a genuinely expensive, special occasion ingredient, running roughly 2 to 3 times the price of an ordinary American lobster. So, at the exact moment New England fishermen were calling lobster bugs and burying the shells so the neighbors wouldn't see them, a different coastal culture on the opposite side of the world was carving lobsters into sword hilts and serving them as a formal wish for a long and prosperous life. Same general category of animal, same era roughly. 2 civilizations that had never met, arriving at opposite conclusions about what a shellfish with claws and a curved back was actually worth. Before we get to that standoff, here's something worth knowing that has nothing to do with any of it. Lobster blood isn't red. It's blue, pale, almost translucent blue when it's flowing, and it turns a cloudy sky blue when exposed to air. The reason is a copper-based molecule called hemocyanin, which carries oxygen through the lobster's body the way iron-based hemoglobin carries oxygen through ours. Copper, when it binds to oxygen, produces a blue color instead of red. It's the same chemistry, functionally, behind why some deep-sea creatures and even certain spiders and snails also run blue-blooded. Next time you see a lobster in a tank, know that underneath that hard shell is running a color you'd expect from science fiction, not seafood. In the early 1960s, French fishing vessels that had spent years harvesting spiny lobster off the coast of newly independent Mauritania suddenly found themselves shut out as France's African colonies gained independence and revoked the free access French boats had enjoyed. Looking for a new source, French fishermen heard about waters teeming with lobster on the other side of the Atlantic, off the coast of Brazil, and set out to get there. They knew Brazil would object to foreign boats simply showing up to harvest a national resource. So the French requested a permit to conduct lobster research instead. Technically true in the loosest possible sense, since research and commercial harvesting used more or less the same boats and the same nets. Brazilian naval inspectors caught on quickly, found the French vessels running large-scale commercial trawling rather than research, and revoked the permits that same spring. By November of that same year, the French were back, requesting a new license, this time to operate further out, beyond what they argued was Brazil's territorial waters altogether. When a French vessel was caught fishing well inside that boundary just weeks into the new year, Brazil's navy seized it, and what had been a quiet fisheries dispute turned into a genuine diplomatic standoff. And the argument that both governments' lawyers ended up making, in formal terms, at multiple points across 1962 and 1963, came down to one specific legal question: is a lobster a fish? Under the 1958 Geneva Convention on the High Seas, any nation's fishing fleet could catch fish in international waters without needing another country's permission. France argued that lobsters, because they moved along the seafloor in a manner France's lawyers described as functionally swimming, counted as fish, and were therefore fair game anywhere outside Brazil's narrow territorial limit. Brazil argued the opposite, that lobsters, because they crawled rather than swam, were a resource of the continental shelf itself, tied to Brazilian sovereignty regardless of how far offshore the water technically extended. It escalated well past legal filings, and it escalated unevenly, in fits and starts. On January 2, 1962, the Brazilian Navy caught a French vessel called the Cassiope, fishing lobster roughly 10 miles off the coast, well inside the disputed boundary, and seized it outright. Brazilian patrol boats spent the following months boarding and impounding French vessels, one after another, forcing captains to sign statements promising not to return. Statements the same captains routinely ignored within weeks. At one point, Brazil's president, João Goulart, personally intervened to release 3 captured French boats and allow them to resume fishing, hoping to diffuse tensions with France, a major economic partner Brazil had no real interest in antagonizing. The Brazilian public reacted with outrage at what looked like their government caving, and the order was rescinded almost as quickly as it had been issued. By late February 1963, Brazil had run out of patience entirely and issued France a 48-hour ultimatum to withdraw its fishing fleet from the disputed waters altogether. France's president, Charles de Gaulle, a man not exactly known for backing down from a fight, responded by dispatching the destroyer Tartu, along with a broader naval task force, toward the Brazilian coast. For several tense weeks in early 1963, 2 nations had warships shadowing each other in the South Atlantic over the legal definition of a crustacean, all while Brazil's navy, working with aging World War II-era vessels and limited fuel reserves, scrambled to mobilize enough ships and sailors during the middle of Carnival to meet the more modern French fleet at sea. Neither side ultimately fired a shot. France's fleet, running low on fuel and facing a mobilized Brazilian navy, withdrew, and the 2 countries settled on an agreement allowing a limited number of French boats to fish under license for several years, while Brazil formally extended its territorial waters to 200 nautical miles, a change that, in the years that followed, helped set the template for how exclusive economic zones would eventually be defined worldwide under international maritime law. All of that prompted by a question that still doesn't have one universally agreed answer. What is a lobster exactly, and who gets to decide? By the 1870s, wealthy vacationers from Boston and New York had started summering on the Maine coast, and unlike generations of colonists before them, they were eating lobster prepared properly, boiled alive, served hot with melted butter, rather than boiled long after it had died and gone rubbery. The difference in flavor and texture was enormous, and these tourists went home raving about a food their own coastal countrymen had spent 2 centuries trying to avoid. In 1876, a sea captain named Ben Wenberg walked into Delmonico's, one of the most celebrated restaurants in New York, and showed the kitchen a new preparation. Lobster meat sautéed in butter, flamed with sherry, and finished in a rich cream sauce with egg yolks and cayenne. The dish, eventually known as Lobster Newburg, became so popular that when Wenberg had a falling out with the restaurant's owner and the dish got pulled from the menu, customers protested until it came back under a slightly altered name. What a sea captain improvised at a chafing dish turned into one of the defining luxury dishes of the era. That set the stage for the Lobster Palaces, a string of enormous, ornately decorated restaurants that opened around Times Square starting in the late 1890s. Built with marble fountains and crystal chandeliers and centered almost entirely around one ingredient. For roughly 14 years, through the turn of the century and into the First World War, these were the places to be seen in American high society. Broadway actors dropped by after their shows. Newly wealthy industrialists went specifically to be seen spending money in public. If you wanted to signal that you'd arrived, socially and financially, you ordered the lobster. The demand this created came at a cost the animal itself couldn't sustain. By 1918, decades of increasingly aggressive harvesting had thinned Maine's annual lobster catch down to roughly £33 million, a fraction of what the same waters had produced a generation earlier, back when lobster was still considered too worthless to bother regulating. For the first time in the species' long American history, rising demand and a shrinking supply were pushing in the same direction at once, and the price followed accordingly. That first golden run collapsed with the 1929 stock market crash. The lobster palaces closed, prices cratered, and along the Maine coast, the old shame briefly resurfaced. Families who'd fished lobster for generations found themselves eating it again out of necessity rather than choice, and children reportedly tried to trade lobster sandwiches for anything else at school, embarrassed by what the meal signaled about their family's finances. Then, during the Second World War, meat, sugar, and butter were all tightly rationed by the federal government. But lobster wasn't considered important enough to bother regulating, and fell through the cracks entirely. Home cooks who couldn't get steak turned to lobster instead, out of scarcity rather than taste, and in doing so rediscovered what railroad passengers had figured out decades earlier. It was genuinely good. When the war ended, returning soldiers who'd developed a taste for it overseas, combined with a post-war economy putting more disposable income in more American households than ever before, locked lobster's reputation in for good. This time, unlike after the 1929 crash, the luxury status stuck. Lobster's modern problem isn't a supply glut or an old reputation crisis. It's a fight with an endangered species, and it's still being litigated as this video is being made. The North Atlantic right whale is one of the most endangered large mammals on the planet, with roughly 384 individuals estimated to remain. Whales get fatally entangled in the vertical ropes that run from the ocean floor up to lobster trap buoys, and starting in 2018, federal regulators and conservation groups pushed for increasingly strict rules on how the lobster fishery operates, including a push toward ropeless gear that keeps buoys on the seafloor until a fisherman remotely triggers their release. In 2020, a federal judge found that existing regulations violated the Endangered Species Act, forcing regulators to rewrite the rules. When the new rules still weren't judged strict enough, Maine's congressional delegation secured a legislative reprieve, buying the industry a multi-year delay while research on ropeless technology continued. Then, in 2022, the Monterey Bay Aquarium in California added Maine lobster to its consumer red list, publicly urging shoppers and retailers not to buy it, on the grounds that the fishery's rope-based gear was contributing to right whale deaths. The Maine Lobstermen's Association responded by suing the aquarium for defamation, arguing the red list rating had caused quantifiable economic harm to the industry. That case has moved through federal court for years, with judges expressing genuine skepticism about whether a scientific opinion, even a damaging one, can legally be defamation at all. In 2024, in the middle of all that litigation, NOAA investigators confirmed, for the first time, a direct link between a right whale's death and lobster fishing gear specifically traced to Maine waters, undercutting one of the industry's core arguments, just as the lawsuit was gaining traction in the appellate courts. Meanwhile, researchers at the University of Maine have been asking a more practical question. Would consumers actually pay more for lobster caught with the safer, costlier ropeless gear? Early results suggest many would, by a few dollars per lobster roll. But willingness to pay depends heavily on how much a given customer already knows about the underlying whale conservation fight, which means the industry's own reputation, not just its gear, is shaping how this resolves. It's worth sitting with how strange this particular fight actually is compared to everything else in lobster's history. Every previous turn in this story, the shame, the canning boom, the railroads, the Gilded Age glamour, was driven by what humans thought lobster was worth, or what it said about the person eating it. This is the first chapter in 3,000 years where the animal's fate is being decided mainly by its relationship to something else entirely. A whale most lobster customers will never see swimming anywhere near their dinner. Unlike the animal's earlier reputational battles, this one isn't about whether people want to eat lobster. It's about whether the way lobster gets caught can survive contact with an endangered species most diners will never see, and whose fate is now legally, if reluctantly, tangled up with lobster's own. The French fishing boats that sailed for Brazil back in 1961 mostly launched from a single port, Camaret-sur-Mer, a small harbour town on the tip of the Coastline Peninsula in Brittany. By the mid-20th century, Camaret had built itself into Europe's leading lobster port, sending crews as far as Mauritania and eventually Brazil, in search of new grounds once its home waters and its African colonial access ran thin. That success didn't last. Overfishing, tightening European Union quotas, and shrinking access to distant fishing grounds pushed Camaret's lobster fleet into decline through the 1990s, until the town that had once launched a diplomatic standoff with Brazil pivoted almost entirely to tourism and yacht moorings instead. The lobster boats that provoked an international incident are largely gone. The harbour that sent them is still there, selling the memory of it to visitors. 60 years after French warships shadowed Brazilian patrol boats over the legal definition of a lobster, a strikingly similar dispute broke out again, just with a different pair of nations. And this time, the French fleet came from ports across the whole of Brittany and Normandy, not just Camaret alone. In May of 2021, in the wake of Britain's exit from the European Union, French fishermen found themselves needing new licenses to fish waters off Jersey, a British Crown dependency in the English Channel, where French boats had operated for decades under the old EU rules. When Jersey's government began requiring proof of prior fishing activity that many smaller boats simply couldn't produce, roughly 70 French vessels staged a dawn blockade of Jersey's main harbour, flares burning, foghorns blasting, refusing to let local boats leave port. French politicians floated the idea of cutting off the undersea power cables that supply electricity to the island. Britain, in response, sent naval patrol vessels to the scene. One French skipper hung a hand-lettered sign on the back of his boat, reading in English, "Jersey government, kill us." Another told a reporter, half joking, that he'd already refueled and was ready for a rematch of an old-fashioned naval battle. At the heart of it, once again, was the same category of animal that had sent warships toward Brazil in 1963. Lobster, along with crab and scallops, all covered under the same disputed licenses. Nobody in 2021 was arguing over whether a lobster counted legally as a fish, but the underlying shape of the fight, a coastal nation's fishermen insisting on access to waters that had recently been reclassified, against a government insisting the old rules no longer applied, was close enough to the 1963 standoff that British newspapers covering the blockade leaned hard into the echo, running headlines that borrowed the language of naval warfare for a fight that was, once again, fundamentally about lobster pots. The confrontation eventually cooled through negotiation rather than escalation, much like its predecessor 60 years earlier. Some fights, it turns out, don't really end. They just wait for the next generation of fishing boats to pick them back up. An animal that Roman emperors once showed off at banquets ended up buried in colonial backyards so the neighbors wouldn't see the shells. A creature considered so degrading that prisoners protested being fed, it became the centerpiece of the most expensive restaurants in Gilded Age New York. A food dismissed as garbage for 2 straight centuries in one country was, across those very same centuries, being carved into sword hilts and served as a formal wish for a long life somewhere else on the map. And a single, unresolved legal question, what is a lobster really, and who gets to decide, has now sent 2 different pairs of nations to the brink of open conflict, decades apart, without anyone fully settling the answer either time. Nothing about the animal itself ever changed. Its claws are the same claws. Its meat is the same meat. A slipper lobster in Australia gets called the bug with genuine affection. At the very moment the word bug was, on the other side of the world, once used as an insult sharp enough to justify feeding an animal to pigs. A fishing dispute over lobster nearly pulled 2 navies into open conflict in 1963, and the same shape of dispute over the same animal broke out again in 2021, 60 years and 1 ocean crossing later, without either side quite noticing the echo. What changed over and over for 3,000 years was never the lobster. It was who was looking at it and what they decided in that particular decade on that particular coastline it was worth. If you didn't see that coming, hit subscribe. There's more forgotten history where that came from.